I'm making another video reading from the Ancient Mysteries of Modern Masonry. But I've been reading a little bit of the news. I kind of wanted to share some things that I find a little bit is a little bit important. And early this April, CNN reported, the Communist News Network, CNN, but anyways, public anger mounts in lockdown Shanghai with no end in sight. Here's what you need to know. Hong Kong CNN. Millions of people across China's lockdown financial hub of Shanghai have been desperately seeking medical care and basic supplies like food. Parents have been forcibly separated from young children infected with COVID-19. Imagine that? And public anger is mounting, with no end in sight as China clamps down. Since March, China has battled its biggest COVID wave yet. And, it's not even a COVID anything. It's creating this hysteria so they can have an excuse to control everybody's lives over there. China's a totalitarian cesspit, with Shanghai now the largest hotspot. All 25 million residents are under lockdown, with national health care workers and the Chinese military dispatched to boost the city's response. On Wednesday, the country recorded close to 20,000 new cases, far past the peak of Wuhan of 2020 at the onset of the pandemic. I call bullshit on that one, but anyways, though this number is still far lower than in many other countries, it's a dramatic spike for China, which has adhered to a strict zero COVID strategy that aims to stamp out all outbreaks and chains of transmission using border controls, mass testing, quarantines, and stringent lockdowns. The sustainability of that policy is now under question as newer highly infectious COVID variants continue to spread throughout the population. So all these border controls, mass testing, quarantines, and stringent lockdowns just shows you that doesn't do anything anyways. China is the biggest tyrant with the lockdowns, and yet again, COVID continued to spread. So It said after denying for days that it had any plans for a citywide lockdown, the government announced on March 27th it would launch a staggered lockdown, first targeting one half of the city, then the other half. By the 31st of March, the government had abandoned its staggered approach, effectively imposing a citywide lockdown for all 25 million residents who were forbidden from leaving their neighborhoods except to get tested. And some of them are just locked down in their apartments. I mean, you just see that footage where, they're in their apartments in these buildings, whatever, and you can hear the whole city, this eerie screaming, Talked about that earlier, but, Anger swelled last month after an off-duty nurse in Shanghai died after being turned away from an emergency ward at her own hospital that was closed for disinfection. Another Shanghai resident died after suffering a medical emergency in his home before being able to reach the hospital. Quote, "We're not killed by COVID, but by the COVID control measures," unquote, noted one popular comment on the highly censored Chinese social media platform Weibo. Highly, because China is all for the truth, and that's why they have to censor everybody. Recent images of social media showed cleaning workers sleeping in a garage in the neighborhood of Shanghai. A cleaning worker from the neighborhood told CNN the workers have been asked to live in the garage for almost a week after testing positive for COVID. There was also an outrage over the Shanghai's policy requiring all COVID-positive patients to be isolated in facilities, even young children and babies. One mother told CNN she had been separated from her infected 2-year-old daughter on March 29th, was not allowed to enter the isolation ward to stay with her daughter until a week later. And I'm sure it's just worse. I mean, CNN is in cahoots with those people anyways. They're just going to keep pushing. And China, if you want to know our future, just go look at China. That's what they want to do to the whole world. And it's also no surprise that late last month, CBS News came out with this headline: Russia says it's building a new democratic world order with China. And Forbes, Russia and China are leading a new world order. Newsweek, Russia promotes new world order with China. You know, so it's no surprise. Well, those of us who do know the main groups that are responsible for all this craziness that's going on, we'll read a little bit from their own books and writings to see what these, to get a little more insight into what these nutbags really believe. So I guess I left off at page 20, Secrecy of Initiates. Yeah. Okay. So I'm starting at page 20. Secrecy of Initiates. This has been the method of all great instructors. Initiates of all ages have maintained a profound silence concerning the truths learned in the mysteries. From Orpheus, the first initiate of whom history catches a glimpse, to Pythagoras, Confucius, Buddha, Apollonius, Jesus, Sackus, no teacher ever committed anything to writing for indiscriminate public use. Herodotus, in speaking of the reasons why animals were worshipped, says, quote, "If I were to explain these reasons, I should be led to the disclosure of these holy matters, which I particularly wish to avoid," unquote. And again in other matters concerning these, at the same time that I confess myself sufficiently informed, I feel myself compelled to be silent. Of the ceremonies also in honor of Ceres, I may not venture to speak further than the obligations of religion will allow me. Jesus charged his disciples that they tell no man that he was the Christ, also saying, quote, "Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn again and rend you," unquote. He surely had good reason for this secrecy. Many have learned the wisdom of these words when too late. Anaxagoras, Pythagoras, Socrates are notable examples. The great teachers instructed their chosen disciples in the higher knowledge and propagated these truths in allegories and parables. Quote, "All that can be said concerning the gods," unquote, says Strabo, "must be by exposition of old opinions and fables. It being the custom of the ancients to wrap up in images and allegory their thoughts and discoveries concerning nature," unquote. Pythagoras, the great mathematical mason, divided his classes into the exoteric and esoteric, and his secrets were forbidden to be committed to writing. The Society of the Essenes, among whom were St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist, made similar distinctions, dividing their adherents into neophytes, brethren, and perfect, while Ammonius Saccus obliged his disciples by oath not to divulge his doctrines except to those who have been thoroughly instructed and prepared. In Egypt, we find the same method in practice, for Clement says, quote, "The Egyptians did not entrust the mysteries they possessed to all and sundry, and did not divulge the knowledge of divine things to the profane," unquote. He also informs us that the sphinxes erected in front of the temples and places of initiation denoted silence and secrecy, that all sacred truth is enfolded in symbolic fables and allegories. And he says of the mysteries, quote, "Those who instituted the mysteries, being philosophers, buried their doctrines in myths so as not to be obvious to all," unquote. And that's taken from the Stromata, Book 5, Chapter 7 and Chapter 9. The sages of Greece, according to Pausanias, quote, "never wrote otherwise than in an enigmatical manner," unquote. They concealed their knowledge under the veil of fiction, and so taught that the vulgar might not comprehend. The typical Hermes assembled his disciples in a holy place or shrine where strict secrecy was imposed. In the Perfect Sermon, he says, quote, "And ye, O Tat, Asclepius and Ammon, in silence hide the mysteries divine within the secret places of your hearts, and breathe no word of their concealment," unquote. This was the universal procedure. Says W.M.R. Singleton, 33rd degree, past Grand Secretary, Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia, quote, "The wisdom of the Chaldeans, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Jews of Zoroaster, Sanchoniathon, Pharisees, Cyrus, Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, of all the ancients that has come into our hand is symbolic. In the method explaining the various symbols, religion, and philosophy were veiled in allegorical representations. These symbols were displayed openly in the temples, to the profane altogether obscure, but streaming with beams of light to the initiated," unquote. And that's taken from History of Freemasonry and Concordant Orders, page 83. Take a little drink here. Okay. Occult systems of writing. There were various methods employed by the teachers to convey and yet conceal the truths of the mysteries. The three main Kabbalistic systems are the Gematria, which is based on the numerical value of words, applying to the letters of a word the sense they bear as numbers. The Tamara, by which a word yields its mystery by anagram, the transposition of the letters, and the Nordericon, which may be compared to stenography. The system of number letters was derived from Chaldea by the Hebrews during and subsequent to their captivity. The Chaldeans worked out their cosmogonies and anthropogenesis and numbers. Their sacred books were written with this object in view. Pythagoras had a number philosophy which in all probability held many resemblances to the number books of Chaldea. This method was developed to a great extent by the Hellenizing tendencies of the cultured rabbis of Alexandria. The Gnostics also made use of this number symbolism. The system of Marcus being quite elaborate, and the books of Hermes are probably the oldest repository of number symbolism in Western civilization. So when you're having these bozo sheep people, then you try to tell them that, the symbolism of these occult sacred societies and how they communicate in gematria and all this other stuff, and the numbers being symbolic too. They want to laugh and say, "Oh, that's just nutty conspiracy theory talk." Just talk to them about these books right here where they omit in their own writings. That's going back to the ancient mystery schools. That is how they communicated. Closely connected with this was geometrical symbolism, which was also used by Pythagoras. The square, triangle, point within a circle, cube, double triangle, the 47th problem of Euclid, etc. The geometrical figures representing the numbers objectively. In every cosmology from the earliest times, we find the basic idea, combining numerical geometrical figures. There is also the allegorical method, a setting forth of truth in the form of myths or parables, and furthermore, the secret sacerdotal tongue, the censar, which was known to the initiates of every nation. Then, to rightly read the world's scriptures, one must have the keys to all these various systems. Object of the mysteries. The object of the mysteries was the instruction and development of man. They were the work of genius, employing the sciences and a profound knowledge of the human heart in the task of purifying the soul and seeking man's felicity by the means of virtue. Great emphasis was laid upon man's immortality, and the object and purpose of the mysteries was to fit him for a blessed state beyond. Thus these mysteries taught the condition of the post-mortem state and strove to develop in the candidate the powers which would enable him to verify the instruction for himself. Antiquity had held that there was a science of the soul, a knowledge of things unseen, a gnosis. And now that the possibility of extending the bounds of consciousness beyond the physical plane has been proven by many experiments in psychism, the claim of the mysteries is not beyond rational belief. That the ego may transcend the limits of the body and become conscious of the higher planes of nature verifies the truth of the mysteries of all ages and proves that nature's God, in infinite wisdom through the constant progress or development of his children, is initiating them from every field of labor to aid in his mighty work. The higher instruction was not only given by perfected initiates who could function on the higher planes, but the assistance of angelic hierarchies was also invoked, and those exalted beings came to teach and elevate by their presence. Iamblichus, the great theurgist of the 3rd and 4th centuries A.D., quote, "The gods, these beings are not gods in the Western sense of the term, but angels or devas. Plato calls them the minor gods to distinguish them from the supreme. Being benevolent and propitious, impart their light to theurgists in unvarying abundance, calling upward their souls to themselves, procuring for them a union with themselves and accustoming them, while they are yet in body, to be separate from bodies and be led around to their eternal and intelligible principle." And every time they talk about these gods that came from the heavens and stuff like that, many people in the UFO field will say that, well, of course, these are aliens. Those who are more of the Christian side will say that they're the Nephilim, they're the demons, whatever you want to make out of it, I guess. I think it's certainly both are possible, and I'm open-minded. I don't know. For, quote, "the soul having a twofold life, one being in conjunction with body, but the other being separate from all body," unquote, "it is most necessary to learn to separate from the body, that thus it may unite with the gods and learn the truths of the intelligible world." Esoteric Christianity, page 24 or 25. And I can't think of her name, but she was pre-Alice Bailey. She was a Freemason lady, but I cannot think of her name. I'll have to get her name, having a moment here. But anyways, I'll probably remember it later. The consummation of all this was to make the initiate a god. There we go. We have another omission from the Mason, who says that these mystery schools they're descended from, and that what the mysteries taught, they teach. And this is not the only one who said that. Manly P. Hall said that in his Lost Keys of Freemasonry. Man is a god in the making. Aleister Crowley had said that. There is no god but man. The consummation of all this was to make the initiate a god, either by union with the divine being without, or by the realization of the divine self within. Salus says that the object of the ceremonies of initiation was to unite man with the world and deity. The initiate claimed that the soul, purified from all stain, could see the gods in this life, that is, could attain the beatific vision and hold communion with the immortals. Professor Harnack remarks that deification was the idea of salvation taught in the mysteries. Reminds me of that that painting of George Washington being deified by pagan gods at that rotunda in the Capitol or whatever. You go somewhere in that building and it's in that rotunda or something like that. It's on the ceiling and it's like you look up and it's George Washington being deified by pagan gods. Interesting, huh? The Greek Neoplatonists called this state theophany, which means either communication between the gods or God and those initiated mortals who are spiritually fit to enjoy such intercourse, or the presence of a god in man, or an incarnation or blending of the personal deity, the higher self with the lower self, its representation on earth. Now we understand whenever you're reading their writings and they're talking about, at-one-ment, atonement, which they separate into three, at-one-ment, at one with the deity, that's what they really mean. Deification, man becoming God. Plotinus defines this state as, quote, the liberation of the mind from its finite consciousness, becoming one and identified with the infinite, unquote. The length and frequency of this sublime condition depends upon the spiritual development. Proclus claims to have experienced this ecstasy 6 times during his mystic life. Plotinus states that he had reached this state but 3 times as yet. Porphyry asserts that Apollonius attained this state 4 times while he experienced it but once, and that after he was 60 years of age. This illumination may come and go as a flash, or it may last for hours. With the high initiates, the Word is really made flesh, the union complete, and its duration continuous throughout life. The mysteries were as a training school to this end. Philo, in speaking of the divine vision, says, quote, it is the special gift of those who dedicate themselves to the service of that which is to ascend by means of their rational faculties to the height of the eye ether. That's A-E-T-H-E-R. That's ether added with an added A to it. Setting before themselves Moses, the race that is the friend of God, the race of the Logos, as the leader of the way. The work of philosophy is not else than the striving clearly to see these things. Proclus also says, quote, in all the initiations and mysteries, the gods exhibit many forms of themselves and appear in a variety of shapes, and sometimes, indeed, a formless light of themselves is held forth to the view. Sometimes this light is according to a human form, and sometimes it proceeds into a different shape, unquote. Quoted in Eleusinian and Bacchic Mysteries, Taylor, page 66. Taylor, too, correctly infers, quote, the most sublime part of the epoptea. Sorry, I'm having on my tongue, whatever. Epoptea, or final revealing, consisted in beholding the gods, high planetary spirits, themselves invested with a resplendent light, unquote. Same book, page 65. In Plato's Phaedo, Socrates is made to say, quote, those who instituted the mysteries for us appear to have been by no means contemptible, but in reality to have intimated long since that whoever shall arrive in Hades, unexpiated and uninitiated, shall lie in mud, which is a symbol of the gloomy surroundings of the lowest region of the astral world. But he that arrives there purified and initiated shall dwell with the gods, unquote. Plato, Carey's translation, volume 1, page 68. Again, in Phaedrus, Plato says, quote, initiated into that which may be rightly called the most blessed of all mysteries, which we celebrated when we were whole and unaffected by the evils that awaited us in time to come. And moreover, when we were initiated in and beheld in the pure light, perfect, simple, calm, and blessed visions, being ourselves pure, and as yet unmasked, with this, which we now carry about with us and call the body, fettered to it like an oyster, to its shell, unquote. If we admit the existence of faculties in man capable of piercing the veil of matter, we shall find no reason for rejecting the plain evidence of ancient writers that the mysteries were associated with a psychic and spiritual revelation. Hermes, in his sermons, has much to say on the gnosis. Gnosis of God is the science of sciences. In the key, he tells us that, quote, the distinctive feature of good, God, is that it should be known, unquote. This is the vision glorious. As stated by Mead in his commentary, quote, this consummation of ecstasis, the extension of consciousness, we are told, was a transcending of the limitations of body, and was a faculty possessed by the forebears of the race into which Hermes and Altat are being born, unquote. Thrice Greatest Hermes, Volume 2, page 162. You'll find that idea of transcending the limitations of body in this transhumanist movement. It's the same goal that the transhumanists are sharing. It's the same goal as stated here that the mysteries had. The nature of ecstasy is further explained as the fruit of meditation and contemplation. The gnosis of the good is holy silence and a given holiday to every sense, unquote. This is in accord with the yoga of the Upanishads, which shows identity of thought of those who have had first-hand experience. Hermes proceeds, quote, for it is possible, my son. Hang on a second. There you go. For it is possible, my son, that a man's soul should be made like to God, e'en while it is still in a body, if it doth contemplate the beauty of the good, unquote. This is the true deification or apotheosis. Man is like God in that he becomes a God. Man is like God in that he becomes a God. The result of the evolution of the soul was the attainment unto the first steps of deathlessness spoken of by Paul as the resurrection of the dead. The soul's vice, says Hermes, is ignorance. But on the other hand, the virtue of the soul is gnosis. For he who knows, he good and pious is, and still while on the earth divine. Here we have the attainment of the divine state, that of adeptship while still in the body. Proclus held that initiation elevated the soul from a material, sensual, and purely human life to a communion and celestial intercourse with the gods, and that a variety of things, forms, and species were shown to initiates representing the first generation of the gods. And speaking of Pedosiris, Proclus tells us that this Egyptian philosopher had an intimate knowledge of every order of the gods and angels, and refers to a hieratic formula of theurgic invocation to the greatest of the goddesses, necessity for inducing the vision of this power. Valens tells us of Natchepso, who attained to direct knowledge of the inner way. Vedius, in the first half of the 1st century A.D., laments that he did not live in those days of initiate kings, rulers, and sages who occupied themselves with the sacred science. In those days, so great was their love for the holy mysteries, so high their virtue, that they left the earth below them, and in their deathless souls became heavenly walkers and knowers of things divine. Vedius also quotes a Greek apocalyptic treatise of Natchepso, where the king tells us that he had remained in contemplation all night, gazing into the aether, and so in ecstasy he left his body, and had then heard a heavenly voice addressing him. This voice was not merely a sound, but appeared as a substantial presence who guided Natchepso on his way through the heavenly space. Thrice Greatest Hermes, Volume 1, page 101. Cicero considered the establishment of the Eleusinian mysteries to be the greatest of all benefits conferred by Athens and other commonwealths. Their effect having been to civilize men, soften savage, ferocious manners, and teach them the true principles of morality, which initiate man into the only kind of life worthy of him. The mysteries procured for man a virile felicity on earth by means of virtue. He was taught the immortality of the soul, the inflexible laws of divine justice, and the great moral precepts were made known not only to the initiates, but also to the profane. The mysteries pointed out to men, the way to live better and die happier, but as we have seen, the object of the mysteries was not merely to teach morality, for as General Albert Pike well said, quote, had moral truths alone been taught the initiates the mysteries could never have deserved nor received the magnificent eulogiums of the most enlightened men of antiquity. Pindar, Plutarch, Isocrates, sorry, I'm pronouncing that right or wrong, whatever, spelled Isocrates, Diodorus, Plato, Euripides, Socrates, Aristophanes, Cicero, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and others, philosophers hostile to the sacerdotal spirit, or historians devoted to the investigation of truth. No, all the sciences were taught there in those oral or written traditions briefly communicated, which reached back to the first age of the world. The object of the mysteries then was to instruct men in the real science of being, and to lead them up the stairway to perfection, to the superhuman stage, to the Christ and that which transcends even perfect masterhood. So they were the source for the teaching of the evolving Superman, the evolving race of Supermen, that the fascists and socialists later, inspired by the writings of Nietzsche, taught. And we know Nietzsche was a member of the Brotherhood, for there's a picture of him, a couple of them I think, and I know one of them anyways, where he's hiding his hand in his coat, which Napoleon, George Washington, Stalin, and Karl Marx, and a bunch of others have done. So we know he came out of a mystery school of some sort. In this way, they sought to purify the soul, holding that true home of the soul was in the higher spheres, the earth a place of exile, and to return to its birthplace, the soul must free itself from the power of the world, must be emancipated from the passions and the hindrances of the senses. The mysteries taught men how to attain the dominion of the soul, which was absolutely necessary, as, quote, we must flee from everything sensual, unquote, says Porphyry, that the soul may with ease reunite itself with God, unquote. Thus the mysteries sought to sanctify men, to illuminate their souls, and fit them to return consciously to union with the deity. The Gnostics all claimed that a man could so perfect himself that he would become a conscious worker with the Logos. The object of the mysteries, then, was not only to teach the unity of God and the immortality of the soul, as Warburton, Mackey, and other Masonic writers contend, but to enable each man to verify these great spiritual facts for himself. These citations from the ancient classic writers and philosophers regarding the mysteries might be greatly extended, but this will suffice to show the reverence and admiration in which the mysteries were held. Would these mysteries have received such high praise had they not known them to be of divine origin? As has been well said, quote, when men like Pythagoras, Plato, and Iamblichus, renowned for their severe morality, took part in the mysteries and spoke of them with veneration, it ill behooves our modern critics to judge them upon their